Welcome to Seeing Eye to Eye, the show about innovation and integration. Why integration and innovation? Because we believe these are key skills for anyone on a path of continual progress, so you can create and successfully live a bold vision for a more meaningful future. We're your hosts. I'm Ash.
And I'm Joya. Join us for conversations that are part entrepreneurial strategy, part philosophical discussion, and part personal development tools. If you are or aspire to be a high-performing and exponentially ambitious entrepreneur, thought leader, or creator, this show is for you. Ask me why.
All right, welcome back everyone to episode 5 of season 1. This is we're an exploration of the 21st Century Renaissance Human Project. So go back if you haven't heard it yet and check out episode 1 of this season to get kind of an overview of that project and what we're talking about this season. And basically, we're exploring these various aspects of life that we think everybody needs to incorporate to have kind of a more well-rounded, meaningful, fulfilling life in the 21st century. And so today, the aspect that we want to explore is what we're calling sort of provisionally the relationship maker, because we haven't figured out a better term for that yet. So Joya, why don't you go ahead and start us off by telling us what you mean by a relationship maker?
And you're right that the term still isn't exactly right, but we are talking all about relationships. So I was just going to share, here's the definition we've come up with provisionally. So this is all about investing in cultivating healthy relationships, building intimacy and sharing values as a partner, family member, and friend. So essentially, we're referring to the close relationships that you create with those who are dearest to you, your romantic partners, your children, close family, friends who are like family, and even business partners, business besties, as we sometimes call it.
Yes, I like that. I had never heard that before. Is that an actual term, or did you just make that up?
No, hashtag business besties.
Really?
Yes.
Wow, I'm out of the loop, I guess. All right, so why is this an aspect of the 21st Century Renaissance Human Project? Why are we separating this out for analysis here? What is, maybe this is obvious, maybe this is one of the most obvious ones, like, gee, why is it important to have deep, meaningful relationships to have a happy, fulfilling life?
I mean, it almost does go without saying. And I think it's actually a good aspect of our culture that as a culture, we recognize this more and more, that building strong relationships, that building communication skills, that it's not just about necessarily marrying the person in the social class that is important, but actually building a relationship on trust, on intimacy, on actually getting to know a person, that having these close emotional ties is important. And it's a major aspect of building and living a thriving life. And I know one point we wanted to talk about was that there's obviously a range of relationships that you want to develop over the course of your life, that there are many relationships that come up around a particular project or a particular situation that would be short-term relationships, but that given our nature as human beings who project and think and act long-term and are on paths of growth, we also want these long-term relationships that we invest in and commit to and cultivate and grow with. And we really wanted to tease out what are the important principles for building and creating good relationships.
Okay. So yeah, so we want to have these deep relationships as against just a bunch of different superficial ones. But there's going to be a range of relationships for different circumstances and for different purposes. But I'm actually going to kind of go off script here a little bit, or off of our notes for what we wanted to talk about, and ask you a question that I think maybe that just occurred to me that people that might come to mind in this context, which is, do you think that, kind of the current technologies that are being developed here as we're moving into the 21st century, like social media and so forth, do you think they're making relationships more superficial? Do you think they're making it more difficult to develop these deeper personal relationships, really close relationships, or do you think they're making it actually, are they helping us develop more meaningful relationships?
No, that's a great question. And the answer probably really is both. And I think that's
Hmm.
exactly what we want to explore here and why we want to explore this topic. Because the technology is here and the technology is definitely changing how we are building and fostering and nurturing relationships.
Yeah.
And so we want to figure out, how do we integrate this technology in our lives well? How do we use this technology so that we're actually building the kinds of good relationships that add tremendous value to our lives?
Okay.
So that is a perfect question, I think, and a good
Yeah.
jumping off point for all the things we want to discuss. Because
Yeah.
you're absolutely right that to a certain extent, social media, on the one hand, allows for these kinds of superficial relationships where you're just hiding behind the screen and can be this anonymous troll. And that's obviously what you don't want
Yeah.
to do and what you
No.
don't want to foster and bring into your life. But then technology is also making possible, I mean, even what we're doing here right
Right.
now, the ability to Skype and have FaceTime conversations. I mean, I know when you and I first met, which is like 15 years ago now,
Mhm.
and you're way on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast, we couldn't just do this and get a chance to actually see each other and talk face to face. So
Yeah.
on the one hand, technology is amazing in allowing us to be closer. Like, I can actually watch your face and read your body language, and we can have that depth of relationship level that wouldn't be possible if we were just trying to communicate on the phone.
Yeah.
So I think it really is all about, how do we think proactively and smart and thoughtfully about how we take these technological developments and actually integrate them into our lives in the best possible way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I totally agree. They've absolutely, a lot of these tools and platforms have, made it possible for people to make connections that they otherwise never would have been able to, that, potentially can develop or be developed into deeper relationships. So, I think that's fantastic. I mean, I just, I remember going to a meetup event one time for a philosophy meetup, um, and we were discussing like technology and pros and cons, and a couple of the people there were arguing that technology was alienating people and making it impossible to have these close relationships and things. And I was just sitting there thinking, like, technology made this meeting possible. None of us would have even been here if it wasn't for like platforms like Meetup.
Mm-hmm.
So there seemed to be a little bit of dissonance going on there, but yeah, but like in some ways, some of these platforms can sort of also um, almost reward in some ways like these more superficial interactions, and so that's something that definitely needs to be looked out for and guarded against, I guess, that people need to be aware of so they can use these tools in ways that actually enhance their lives rather than diminishing them. But you've mentioned a few times already that there's this key point that relationships are built and they require effort and thought and work. So what do you mean by that? Like what? Because I mean, I think there's especially younger people when they're in the context of romantic relationships, when you're dating somebody, I think there's kind of this common idea that relationships shouldn't take work. It should come naturally. It should be easy. It should be fun, right? So like, and I think there's something plausible about that, in that if you're in a relationship with somebody and it just feels like this constant grind or slog, there's something is not going right there. So what do you mean when you say that relationships are built and that they require this kind of continuous work?
No, that's a great question. And the way I love to think about this is that relationships are work, even in the ideal way that we think about what work ought to
Mhm.
be. So there's the understanding, what's the popular phrase, that when you're doing something you love, you never work a day in your life. So
Mhm.
I think that is something that we are all after when it comes to our actual careers and the creative, productive work that we're doing, we want to be using our strengths and meeting these challenges that are right at our skill level. So we're really in flow so that
Yeah.
it feels like it's easy and coming with the flow and coming naturally. But there still obviously is a component of work to it. There's
Yeah.
still effort that needs to be put in. And I think that's important to mention with relationships too. I mean, I think there is still a kind of lingering pernicious idea in the culture that you find the right person, and when you live quote unquote happily ever after, that if they were your absolute prince charming, that suddenly it's just going to be sunshine and rainbows and puppy dogs and bunny rabbits every
Hmm.
single day. And that's not the case. Anybody who's
Yeah.
actually gone through a relationship knows, even when you find someone who is your perfect partner, part of what actually makes them a perfect partner is the fact that you are going to disagree about things, because that is even what enables you to grow and
Yeah.
enables you to do things that you wouldn't be able to do on your own without having the partnership. So there's going to be disagreements, there's going to be misunderstandings, there is effort that has to be put into doing the communication. But I
Right.
think the key point is to recognize that it's important to have this positive emotional framework, to be solutions oriented in how you're approaching the relationship, and
Mhm.
know that it's going to require effort.
Yeah.
Hopefully, fun effort that you wake up excited to do
Uh-huh.
every morning, but effort nonetheless.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's like any kind of productive work, including building a meaningful relationship with another person. You know, if it's going well, it's not going to be that grind or that slog all the time, but it's not going to be that just state of blissful flow all the time either, right? But hopefully the more you can get it into like having, maximizing that flow state within a relationship, the better it's going to be, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we're looking for. But it takes work to get there. And um, so I think, you've talked about that you think that as a culture we've developed a lot in understanding and appreciating this, and most of us are aware of this, and we try to do this, but we could be doing better. So what else should we, or what should we be doing? Like what do you think we need to know to understand that can actually help us do this better?
Yeah, so there's 2 points here that I really wanted to explore, really even for the rest of this episode. So this one idea is, how can we be doing relationships better? So on the one hand, I think today there are relationship experts out there, there's work that's being done in psychology, there are developing ideas about what goes into a good relationship, but then there are still all of these lingering false, often conflicting ideas that are in there in the culture as well. And for any given individual human being, it's not clear, well, so right off the bat, it's not obvious how it is that you build a good relationship. It's not something that's programmed into us. It is something that we have to learn. But
Right.
it's not clear that even that information is readily available throughout the culture. Even the fact that there isn't the quick go to obvious term for what we mean here in this episode, I think is
Right.
already indicates that this problem is here, that we could do more to understand what actually goes into making a good relationship. So that's one of the
Okay.
things I think we definitely want to keep exploring in this episode. And then one aspect of this, to tie it into the whole premise of our show, which is all about innovation and integration, I think integration is a key idea, and we want to look at how we integrate our relationships into our lives as a whole, because we want there to be this holistic sense of the ways in which our relationships fit into our full flourishing lives.
Yeah, and that's what the Renaissance Human Project is all about.
Exactly.
Uh, okay, but so let's jump into that first point then about and talk more about what a good relationship is. And you mentioned that there's kind of a lot of ideas that are just kind of floating out there in the culture, that are often even conflicting or totally contradictory. So like one idea about what makes a good relationship might be, well, like attracts like. So you know, the more similar the other person is to you, the better the relationship will be. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you know, you have this idea that opposites attract, and you want to find somebody who's like completely different from you. That's, you know, I guess the idea there is just that they're much more complementary, so that, you know, if you're good at some things, they're good at other things, and, you know, like together I guess it almost goes back to, you know, tying it back to my philosophy background, you know, uh, Plato, I believe, had this myth of where genders came from, where
Yeah, the
maybe it was even
idea of
like a
what actually
pre-Socratic
makes your
philosopher.
soulmate.
Yeah, because it's like these two people that were like divided at some point, and then they find each other and they actually like fit together in some weird way. But um, so that's an idea that goes back to Plato, this idea that kind of opposites attract. And um,
But even the idea that you are not a whole and you need someone to complete you. I mean, that's been in the
yeah,
culture not all that long ago. What the Jerry Maguire movie, where you need
uh-huh.
somebody to complete you, which is, again, I think, you know, a not so healthy approach to relationships,
Okay,
because
so
you ought to be whole yourself, and then you're finding another whole and
yes,
creating a partnership.
okay, but so you know, it seems like, you know, but I mean, like these are common ideas for a reason. It seems like they're not completely wrong. There's something
Mm-hmm.
right about both of these. So how do you put them together, you know, or what can we draw out of each of these different views that is right, and put them together in a way that is, you know, a more complete picture of what like a good healthy relationship is about.
I think you're right that we're even getting to, there are, in a sense, dual aspects that we want both of them in our lives. So we want both, I guess you could say, stability and adaptability. You
Mhm.
might say security and excitement. So that maybe gets into each of these, right? You want like attracts like, because that's the stable, the comfortable, the familiar. But
Mhm.
opposites attract because you also want the novelty and the excitement and the adventure. And really, in human life, we want to integrate all of these things. And so I think we really even just need a better framework, or better frameworks, for how we think about relationships, and what goes into making a good relationship, and how you want to show up as someone in order to create a good relationship. So
Yeah.
I have this four-part framework that I love to talk about,
So
that I
actually,
think goes into, yeah, before we get into that, you
before
want
we
to talk
get
about
into
something else?
that, yeah. So just on the subject of kind of like attracts like versus opposites attract. I like how you tied that into the you know, the stability and reliability versus, you know, kind of the excitement and challenge. And because we're definitely going to get into that with your framework
Mm-hmm.
here. But I think there's also something else going on there, that, you know, there's just kind of different levels of abstraction where these maybe apply more or less. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I think you do want to find somebody who is broadly similar to you in terms of, you know, your kind of deepest values. Um, but, you know, in some way, you know, at the level of concretes, it can actually be helpful and to have somebody who's more complementary to you in certain ways, or even in the ways that they kind of like approach life in some respects. So, but yeah, I think that's maybe something that we'll get into more here with your other idea. But there was also another kind of common idea in the culture that I thought maybe we should mention briefly, which is, um, you know, there's an idea out there that, you know, like you don't really want to date people with too much baggage. Um,
Except that that's kind of like everybody.
yeah, but you know, it's kind of relative, right? So I don't know. For me, like somebody who's had kind of very long struggles with health issues and things like that, you know, I found when I was dating, it's like it's actually helpful, you know, when meeting people, to find somebody who's had some similar challenges in your life, just so that they can kind of understand where you're coming from and what you've been through, um, and kind of maybe what issues you still have ongoing. So that was helpful, just kind of for hitting it off to begin with. um, and you know, again, I think there is an element of truth to that kind of common idea, where you don't want to get too invested in a relationship with somebody who's, really still in the midst of dealing with serious, struggles, with, traumatic kinds of things where maybe they're just not psychologically whole or well enough to be able to have a healthy relationship with somebody yet.
Mhm.
But, on the other end of the spectrum, there's people who maybe just really haven't been through any real struggles in their life or real challenges. And so you don't know, when challenges arise in the relationship and they're kind of tested in that way, how they're going to respond. And so I almost feel like, you want somebody with like a healthy amount of baggage, that so that that, you know, they've been tested, like they have had to deal with challenges in their lives, and they have learned these kind of coping skills and things that are actually going to be really important for kind of building a strong long-term relationship, and maybe people can learn those along the way as they go, but it's just like, especially if you're like already well into adulthood and you're just looking for like a new romantic relationship with somebody, like if you already know that somebody's dealt with some of that stuff, like I think that can actually be a good sign, and instead of what it's often taken to be like a bad sign, that you don't want somebody with that kind of baggage and drama and whatever. So I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add on that point, or if.
Yeah, one of the ways I think about that is you can't go into a relationship thinking you can fix another person, because
Mhm.
the other person has to take accountability to fix themselves. It's just definitely a principle we even learn as coaches, that the person has to be coachable, that it goes back to their own free will and their own volition and choice. They have to make the decision to change themselves. So you can't go into a relationship thinking you can fix the other person.
Right.
But the thing is, a relationship could be the catalyst that will inspire the person to change themselves.
Sure.
So there's both of those things together.
True. Yeah, and I guess for me, this kind of relates back to, I think, something I mentioned in just the previous episode, maybe, about this phrase that I took from the Serenity Prayer and paraphrased for myself, about embracing adversity as a pathway to progress. And I feel like you want to find, other people in your life that are sort of operating on that same premise.
Mm-hmm.
Because we want to all be on this growth trajectory together. We want to, you don't want to be with somebody who's just very comfortable in the status quo and is not going to respond well to uh, novelty and change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, which I guess brings us into that framework that you had developed for kind of some of the basic elements that go into making a good relationship.
Yeah, this is just a four-part framework that I've developed for myself, just as someone who's gone through both good relationships and bad relationships, and thinking about what makes relationships go well and who do I want to be in a relationship. I see that there are these four parts. So the four parts are presence, support, inspiration, and challenge.
Yeah.
And I realize there's even a connection with something that we've discussed in previous episodes, what I've been calling the two-part formula for happiness. So,
Mhm.
really quickly, this idea was that to live a full, happy life, there are these two parts to it that are seemingly even in tension, but you really need to figure out how to integrate them. So, on the one hand, in order to have happiness, you want to find happiness in the present moment. You want to be focused on gratitude and what's going right and being present in the present moment. But at the same time, you want to be future focused. You want to think about how to improve. And Ash, you made the really great point that there's this tension, because on the one hand, you want to be satisfied with everything that's going well and the values that you're experiencing in the present, but at the same time you want to be dissatisfied because you want to improve and grow and develop into the future. And so it's all
Yeah.
about integrating these components. But I think now this also applies to how we think about relationships.
Yeah.
So here, when we're talking about presence and support, this is on the present tense side of things. It's all about being in the moment, and that this is key to what makes a good relationship. So the first one, just this idea of presence, being present with another person. And I think this even ties back even into our technology conversation, because on the one hand, technology has allowed us to be present with people. I can be present with you here in Skype in a way that I could not be if there wasn't this technology. But there's also a danger that because I'm so busy on my phone, I'm not present with the people who are in my life. So when my husband comes home, or if I'm spending time in person with friends and family, am I so worried about, who's liking my posts on social media, that I'm not actually present with the people who are there? So
Right.
it's being present both physically, but also mentally and emotionally. That aspect of witnessing and mirroring the other person when you are fully present with them. And that's obviously such a huge and foundational value to relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. So to just kind of flesh out this idea of presence a little bit more, I think that's really interesting, because it's, yeah, like you said, it's that you're mirroring back the person to themselves in a way where they can see, uh, by seeing how you react to your shared values, they're seeing kind of in an objective way what that means for themselves. And I think you can actually see that kind of in the reverse way as well, where if somebody reacts in a way to something that means a lot to you, but there's something wrong about it, the you know there I'm trying to remember. I think you had a good example of this. Did you have an example of that? Do you know what I'm talking about?
What you were going to maybe even talk about an experience you had with your family.
Well, the one that I remember was when I was visiting Boston many years ago, and my parents who were living in upstate New York at the time drove up to visit me while I was there, and they were going around seeing some of the Revolutionary War sites, and then I had lunch with them, and they were telling me about that, what they'd been to Bunker Hill, and my father was, really excited about it, and really excited to share it with me and tell me about it, which, you would think would be like, and, because that's something that I'm very interested in too. I'm deeply interested in the American Revolution, and the history behind that, and the ideas. And so you think that might have been like a bonding moment for us, like, an example on the positive side of, having that, you know, sharing that together and being present um, around that, connection between us. But because I knew that it meant something different to him because of, he's coming from a different kind of ideological background where, he thinks that the I don't know how much we want to get into it, but, like his interpretation of the meaning of this revolution is in some ways very opposed to my own. Like it almost felt like, no, you can't you can't value this as much as I do. This can't mean as much to you as I do. And so it was almost kind of, like the same phenomenon, but in reverse,
Yeah,
Uh,
because you weren't actually sharing the value. It's just sort of at a superficial level, you happened to meet around the same thing, but it was built on a completely different value framework. So you weren't actually
right.
sharing the value.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it doesn't mean to him what it means to you.
Yeah, because it's like on one level there seems to be a connection, you're connecting, but then like on a deeper level there's this disconnect. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that, is actually not uncommon in relationships. And so that's kind of where I feel like you want to make sure that you do have kind of a basic affinity with people, especially that you're trying to have like these deeper kind of relationships with at those deeper levels in terms of your fundamental values.
But I think it even just points to the importance of sharing values as just a key component to our human experience, the way we are social beings. So this even gets into an experience I know I wanted to share, something that happened to me. So when I was in my early 20s in 2001, I had the opportunity to go to Italy, and it was part of a whole student group study abroad experience, but the other people in my group were off I guess the Pope was out that day in the Pope Mobile, and they wanted to go
Yeah.
see the Pope, and I wanted to go see the Sistine Chapel.
Yeah.
And it was just such a life expanding, incredible opportunity. But what I remember about it was, on the one hand, being in such awe to be present. Part of the value was to be present in that space where Michelangelo created this fabulous work, but at the same time, feeling so lonely.
Because you
And part of
didn't
this, because I didn't
have
have
someone to
anyone to
share it
share it
with.
with. And it
Yeah.
maybe even gets to this point that there were plenty of other tourists there, but I wasn't actually sharing the value with someone who could be there with me, appreciate what it means. And to have someone to do that with, it's it almost goes without saying, I think, if you're a human being, that you can have everything in the world, but if you don't have someone to share it with, you're
Doesn't
missing
mean as
out
much. Yeah.
on what the true value can be.
Yeah. Okay. So
So
kind of going back. I'm
that
sorry.
would be presence. Oh no, I would say that would be presence,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then
So
we
going
can
back to
maybe
your.
go into support.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one of the things I
Abs-
even realized
well,
about
before
these.
we even,
Oh,
sorry, before we even jump into support, like I wanted to kind of dive a little bit more into the framework. So you already made the connection between, having kind of that present awareness versus that future orientation.
mm-hmm.
Um, but I think there was sort of like an other pattern that we noticed here in between these. So
Yeah,
uh,
that was what I was just going to say. So
okay.
even just kind of connecting presence with support. So both the present and support are on the present side, present tense,
Mhm.
versus the future focus. But one of the ways to think about this pair is that it's perhaps being and doing.
Yeah.
So presence is how you show up, to be present with someone else, and support is what you do. And that can be emotional support, it can be financial support, it can be literal activity, something that you do to help someone else out. But to be there and to be supportive and to have that activity of giving support to someone
Right.
is key to how we build good relationships.
Yeah. And I think, support it is important because, if you can be present and
Mm-hmm.
with somebody, but not necessarily supportive. Like it's like, okay, you know, I can see you're having a hard time and you need help with something, but then not actually follow through and
Mm-hmm.
provide them the help that they need in that situation. Um, so it's like, if you're not there for your partner when they, break their arm and need a ride to the emergency room or something, like they're going to understandably not feel like you're really invested in that
Mm-hmm.
relationship, no matter how sort of present you are, even if you're not like, it's not that you're just ignoring them and are
Mm-hmm.
distracted from them, but like if you're not actually following through and taking action to demonstrate that you value them as a person and you value your relationship with them, uh, then there's definitely something big missing there. So yeah, I think that is definitely another aspect.
I mean, I think it's worth pointing out too that support is important for good human relationships, because as human beings, ideally, we ought to be on these paths of growth. And what that means is we ought to be pushing ourselves out of our comfort zones. We ought to be failing so that we can learn. But what that means is that, how we actually perhaps get through the failures is through the support. And then that just also, encompasses all the things that just happen in life, dealing with disease, dealing with when people die, like how we actually even make it through all of the hardships of life, that
Yeah.
having support is so key. So it's something that we all need as human beings, and how relationships work is when we can be that person who can offer the support to
Yeah.
others when they are in that position.
Right. Yeah. But even like going beyond just kind of supporting people in those situations, like sickness or other kinds of struggles, to, you mentioned, hopefully we're also supporting them in kind of growing and
Mm-hmm.
moving forward in their lives. So that kind of brings us to the future oriented side of your framework. So So I guess inspiration would be on the sort of being side of that. Do you want to talk a little more about that?
Right. So inspiration is perhaps how you think of how you show up so that you can be an inspiration to others around you. How you are the person who sets the example and shows what is possible and sets the standard for which other people can rise and live up to.
Yeah.
So thinking about being that person in your relationships, being the person who can inspire. And then it's something that you ought to look for, I think, in relationships that you seek to build with others. You want to seek out people who will inspire you to reach and grow and become a better version of yourself.
Yeah. And again, like, I think you've done a really good job kind of identifying some of these key aspects of good relationships, because yeah, I think if that element's missing, that is not going to make for kind of a happy long-term relationship. If you're with somebody who just doesn't want to do anything, or if you're the kind of person that, just wants to, sit on the couch and watch Netflix all the time or whatever, not that there's anything wrong with doing that occasionally, but, if you're not the kind of person that's constantly trying to, learn and grow and do new things and, create new, value in the world, um, that kind of person is going to be pretty boring to be with for very long. That's going to get old fast. At least it would for me. If you're the kind of person who wants to do that and you're with somebody who's not that kind of person, that's going to be a kind of pretty fundamental incompatibility, I would think.
Exactly. And
But
then
so
I think
then
that, yeah, I'm sorry, I was saying, and then I think that just gets us to challenge, which
the,
is the
the
doing
doing
aspect of
side.
this.
Yep.
So the way that you actually intervene and interact to challenge someone else. And then you want those people in your life, the people who will throw down the challenge, that will, get you going and moving and working on being that better person.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I found this a really helpful framework. And kind of my first question when you introduced it to me, I was like, that does seem to match up pretty well with the way that I was thinking about these things. But I had just broken it down into kind of two basic components, which is, the two main things that I think most people, need or are looking for out of relationships are, and you already kind of mentioned this, you alluded to this earlier, that these elements of stability versus element of kind of like adaptability.
Mm-hmm.
And I think these are kind of like two basic sides of the spectrum of, how any complex adaptive system works, including, like the interpersonal dynamics of a relationship, between two people. Um,
Yeah, if I
and
could
so
jump
kind of,
in, like one thing that I know
yeah,
you said that I think is really important is that ultimately these things, they do exist on a spiral. So the
yeah,
way I see it is there is a definite hierarchy. So even with these four different elements, these are four things that you ultimately want in your relationships, but you may not have them all at one time or all in one relationship. But I think there is a kind of hierarchy to it, and there is ideally this spiral to it. So to
yeah,
my thinking, the presence comes first. That's the foundational requirement, that without the presence you don't really have a relationship if the people are not present to one another. So that's the key one that you need, and these others can grow and come over time. And so in that sense, I almost realized it's kind of a little bit almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that you start
mhm,
even with security first and it builds up to self-actualization. But Maslow's is a pyramid, and I think the way you and I like to think about it, it really is more of the spiral, because it's
yeah,
never just that you get all of these basic needs met once and for all and then you somehow get up to self-actualization and it's just that from here on out.
right,
It's that this is a constant continual process where
yeah.
you're continually spiraling through.
Yeah, and each higher level that you reach actually then helps you kind of go back and do the previous levels that it is based on to be able to do those better. And what that reminds me of is, I remember when I was starting to date again after kind of my major, my long-term relationship, first long-term relationship as an adult ended, as I was kind of starting to come out of my, chronic health issues. And I was, using one of the online dating sites, and one of the match questions that they had was like, would you prefer a relationship that is, more reliable or more full of excitement? And I hate those kind of binary questions, because it's like,
It's both and.
you really do need both. And I think what the question is trying to get at is like, well, what's more important to you of these two things if you had to pick one? um,
But you
but
shouldn't have to pick
to me,
one.
it's like you can't really separate them, because exactly, there is this sort of spiral relationship between them. And if you don't have either one of those elements, like the other one is not going to be sustainable either. Like
Mm-hmm.
without, yeah, you absolutely have to have that reliability, or it doesn't matter how exciting a relationship is, it's going to burn out fast, right?
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, if you don't have, any excitement or anything new in your relationship, it is just going to quickly fall into a rut and just become completely stagnant. And neither of those are going to be good relationships for anybody involved, right? Um, but yeah, so I had kind of, through my experiences, starting to date again as an adult, I had kind of come to the conclusion that it's like, well, I want the stability side and I want the adaptability side. And so when I saw your framework, I'm like, oh, well, the support and presence, those are kind of on the stability side, and the inspiration and challenge, that's kind of like the adaptability side. And so I was kind of like, my first question was, well, so why do you separate out into these four things? But then, I think we already addressed that with, that it's kind of the being versus doing side of each of those.
Mm-hmm.
So I did find that very helpful. But uh, I also, I think this is kind of something that is even historically recognized, almost, where these are kind of two fundamental aspects or sides of a relationship that everybody is looking for. And if you can find both of those sides to the extent that you need in a single relationship, that's fantastic. But that's not always going to be the case for everybody. And so you even see, like, in the context of romantic relationships, like historically, you can look back, like, I don't know, 18th century France or something. There's the idea of, you've got your wife and you've got your mistress, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like the rock and the muse, or you can take it back all the way to ancient Greece. You have, again, like the men would have like a wife who kind of runs their household and they have children with and whatever. And then they've got, like kind of a protege young man who is like, who they have intellectual conversations with,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of thing, right? This is like an idea that's a model that's kind of talked about in Plato's Symposium. Um,
But I think this is
and
even why we want this key idea that there is a skill, and why having this framework is useful, because even the way it breaks it up into being and doing, because it gives you a framework for what it is you have to do and how you have to show up. Because I think you're right to even tie this back to things that we were saying, that at a certain level, you want a kind of compatibility between you and your partner. You want there to be actual deep values that you share. It can't just be the superficial, oh, we both kind of like the Revolutionary War heroes, if they're for completely different ideas of what heroism is, or the
what they
value of the
stand for, and
Revolutionary War is and
yeah,
what it stands for. So there is a kind of compatibility that you want there. But even in terms of compatibility, one, we're always growing human beings. So people themselves are, as individuals, are growing and developing. So even, how you might match with that compatibility could change. But
right,
there's also this element of, even with a certain compatibility, what makes for the good relationship is how you actually show up, the being, and what it is you actually do. So it
yeah,
can't even just be this compatibility, but how it is that you actually choose to show up and live and build this relationship on a day by day basis. I can say that even is sort of, I think, the story with my husband and myself. So when I met my husband, we met through another one of these dating apps. But our story is, we actually moved in together after our second date, because I think
wow,
both of us recognized after two dates that there was enough compatibility to have something to work with there,
that's
and
amazing.
that really beyond that, it's really just all about doing the
The
work and
details.
building the relationship and how we show up for each other and the things that we do to be present, supportive, inspiring, challenging on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. I don't know. I feel like I kind of want to like ask you more questions about that, but maybe we should just kind of move on to other
Maybe that
things.
can be
But
a future, if people are
yeah,
interested,
yeah,
we can do a bonus behind the scenes episode.
sure, yeah. Okay, yeah, but so, I just, I think it's interesting that there's kind of like these different ways of looking at it that are kind of getting at the same thing, whether it's from this,
Hmm.
more historical perspective. But, and that even like raises interesting cultural issues like, well, why did these, people in these societies in ancient Greece and France need to have like these separate relationships to fulfill these different needs? And maybe it's because, like, the gender roles in those societies confined,
Hmm.
people to certain roles and things like that, that hopefully are less issues now.
Hmm.
But it's still not necessarily the case that you're going to be able to find everything you need in a single relationship. But like you said, this is something that can shift over time and change. And hopefully, like within a relationship, each partner, being aware of this can try to increase their ability to be present and supportive on the one side, and
Hmm.
also their ability to be, an inspiration to their partner and to challenge them on the other side, right? So
Hmm.
that each person can become more able to fill those needs for their partner. Um,
But
and
now I know you wanted to integrate
yeah,
another
so
biological
this,
framework into this
mhm.
too. So maybe we can get into that as well.
Yeah, well, this ties down to, because I think how any relationship kind of depends. The relationship dynamics are going to depend in large part on kind of the individual psychologies of the people involved, which in turn kind of depend on their ingrained habits as well as kind of their underlying you know physiological and neurological ways of interacting with the world and with other people. And so like the one framework that I think kind of ties into a lot of what we've already been saying, but also kind of helps give like a little bit deeper understanding that I found really clarifying, uh, comes from, um, I think originally comes from a psychologist named, I believe it was Paul Gilbert, who wrote a book called The Compassionate Mind. But I encountered it through, there were a series of books that were uh, kind of spun off of his framework and applied to more specific areas in psychology. So I read a book that it was like a workbook called The Compassionate Mind Guide to Recovering from Trauma and PTSD by Deborah Lee and Sophie James. And so they laid out this framework in there, where they talked about kind of psychologically, we all have uh, three systems that interact, that they what they call affect regulation systems. Um, and so, kind of like the most obvious one that people would be, familiar with is what they call the threat protection system. So that's kind of, fight, flight, or freeze. It's like the
Hmm.
sympathetic nervous system kind of underlies that. So it's
I once
uh,
heard of that as there's the four
the
F's:
four F's. Yeah.
fight, flight, fright, and sex.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's like the standard intro medical school joke. But so yeah, it's it's an arousal system. It's an excitatory system in your nervous system that responds to perceived negatives in your environment, to these threats. Um, on the other side, they have what they call the achieving and activating system, or the achievement activation system, something like that, which is an excitatory system that's in response to perceived values in your environment. So it's like, oh, there's potential prey I want to go hunt down and kill so I can eat it or whatever. Um, and then the third one is kind of the one that inhibits both of those, and it's what they call the affiliative and soothing system. Um, and so, that's supposed to, like, when either of those other excitatory systems kind of get too worked up, you want to be able to like regulate that and pull it back.
Hmm.
Um, And I think the reason they have the term affiliative along with soothing there is because they're saying, like an important part of how we do this is in our interactions with other people. And so, like in parent-child relationships, traditionally the mother would play more of that soothing role, right? Whereas the father would more of um, the stimulating role, but that could be in a positive or negative way, like wait till
Hmm.
your father gets home. Um, but like in general, whether it's in parent-child relationships or adult relationships, I think you need somebody who can activate both your soothing system and stimulate your achievement system in the appropriate circumstances, right?
Hmm.
And that kind of I think is what underlying fulfilling these kind of basic psychological needs for stability and adaptability that we've been talking about. Um, did you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think it's just great. It's just another integration to another level of our biology and how this then shows up culturally in our and socially in our relationships.
Yeah, and there's obviously a lot more you could say on that. They
Hmm.
talk about like kind of the different neurotransmitters that are involved in these different systems and kind of like how all of these systems interact with each other. And they were, like I said, they were doing it in the context of helping people deal with trauma and PTSD. Um, but so I kind of took that same basic framework and said, oh, like you can see how this would apply to relationships as well,
Hmm.
um, and it fits in, kind of like with these higher order frameworks that we've been discussing about it. So I think, yeah, I feel like that's pretty good discussion of that first point that we wanted to talk about what is a good relationship. It's kind of on an abstract level, but like you want somebody who's supportive as well as it's challenging to you in the right way at the right time, as Aristotle would say, right?
Hmm.
Um, but kind of, I guess that leads us into our next point, which is how do we integrate our relationships more fully with the rest of our into the rest of our lives as a whole?
Right. I mean, and maybe one way to make this transition is again just to emphasize that, you might not have all of these things all at once. So it is about viewing this over time and making an investment in these relationships and working on them as they develop over time. But maybe we can even shift to thinking about how this fits in with the possibilities for relationships now in the 21st century, even tying this back to our conversation about technology and even a conversation that we had in an earlier episode about when we were looking at the what I think has always been the flawed model of work life balance, but we
Yeah,
discussed it as a model that doesn't even make sense anymore in the 21st century. And what does make more sense now that people do have this opportunity to live more self directed lives, to work from wherever, to be able to integrate their work and their relationships in a more seamless way. So, did you
right.
have some ideas you wanted to start sharing even about that?
Um, well, yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess people can definitely go back and revisit that earlier episode if or if they haven't heard it, go back and check that out about work-life balance versus work-life integration, or if we even need some other way of thinking about that. And I might have actually used this example in that earlier conversation. I don't recall now, but I know we had talked at one point. I can't remember if it was in that recording or not, but about this one example that I thought was really fascinating in terms of just like kind of a concrete example of that for me was there's a movie that came out in this past year about Ruth Bader Ginsburg called On the Basis of Sex
I still
that
need to
talks
see
about,
that.
yeah, I wonder if it's probably on maybe on Netflix now or something, but it's
Hopefully.
um, a really well done movie, and it kind of talks about um, how she is trying to challenge these laws that discriminate on the basis of sex as being unconstitutional. Um, and kind of like the case that she uses to do that. But what I found really interesting about the movie in this context was that it really was one of the best portraits I've ever seen of somebody integrating their personal and their work lives in this way, where she and her husband, who was also a lawyer, were um, really working on this together. It was like a real partnership, and he was really supporting her in this almost crusade of hers, and but then also how it played into their children's lives and their relationships with their children. And because like I remember there's one part in the movie where because before Ruth Bader Ginsburg had started pursuing this legal case, she had after she had gotten her law degree, she had ended up just kind of going back and teaching, and her daughter, who is like becoming going into her teenage years during this period, as depicted in the movie, had started getting involved with some of like the cultural movement that was happening at the time in the 60s, and I can't remember exactly when this is set, the exact year or whatever, but and her daughter at one point says to her, like, you talk about these ideas about equality and justice and stuff, but like, are you ever going to do anything about it, or are you just like, are you just going to tell people that this is how it should be, but never like really actually try to change the system,
Mm-hmm.
and so her daughter in a way like was an inspiration to her, but then by her actually starting to actually pursue that actively, she actually was becoming more of a role model for her daughter as
Mm-hmm.
well. So it's just like a really fantastic example of a really well integrated work life situation for that entire family, the way that it was depicted in the movie, at least. So, um, but I know you had some other ideas about how to integrate personal and work lives, and ways that people can do that, and whether it's not necessarily even those kind of really close personal, like immediate family kind of relationships, but even just with um, friends and what did you call it, work besties and
Yes,
things like
business
that.
besties.
Business besties, yes.
Yeah. I mean, to me, as someone who's made the shift to be an entrepreneur and someone who can hashtag work from wherever, to go back to the popular hashtag phrases, to live this lifestyle that is more self directed, where I can work from home or really work from wherever. And it's going to be one of the things we're going to start exploring even in this week's weekly challenge. But the possibility to have accountability partners, I think, is more popular than ever as a new variation on just having a coworker. So this even gets back to the idea that in the 20th century, it might have made a little bit more sense to have these completely separate buckets for work and personal life, because you perhaps woke up in the morning in your home, you drove off to your work, you had your work life in that location with those people, and then that ended and you came back home and you had your home life in that location and with those people. But while that model is disappearing, there are just all these great opportunities to merge all these aspects of life. And one of the best that I found is this idea of accountability partners, where it's people who can serve to hold you accountable to both your business goals and your life goals as
Yeah,
one seamless thing. But we're going to explore that in the weekly challenge. But
yeah,
maybe right now we can finish this off by, we wanted to say a few things even about predictions for the 21st century, because I think you and I have seen, even just in our lives since the 1980s, how relationships and cultural attitudes about relationships have changed across the 20th century into the 21st century. So maybe some trends and ways that these might change as the
right.
21st century continues.
Yeah, so even before we get into that, though, just to add on to what you were saying there about accountability partners and things, I think it's interesting because that's actually how we sort of reconnected at
Mm-hmm.
first, um, recently, before we started, had the idea to do this podcast, and so that kind of led us into actually doing this more kind of specific project together. So,
And now we are business besties as well as
yeah,
friends.
okay, yeah, totally, absolutely. All right, but so then to go back into the what how did you put it? Look at the kind of the trends of how relationships might develop going forward in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and I think you're right there that there are these trends that we've already started seeing. We can go back, even a couple of generations, like with our parents or grandparents, where prior to that, like even divorce was not really an option for most people,
It
and
was
like it wasn't
scandalous.
even legal in a lot of places,
Mm-hmm.
right? Including in the US, until relatively recently historically. But so kind of back then the model was like, okay, from at a fairly young age, like you attach yourself to one person, and then that's it. Like that's your primary partnership in life until death do you part.
And you were probably a virgin at marriage, and
Uh,
so you probably had no sense to even learn what you might have wanted out of life or a partner, and you were just
right.
stuck with that forever.
Yeah. And so then I think most people would say this is probably a positive development that, now it became over time a little bit easier to sever that kind of arrangement when necessary or when desirable. And so, it became a little bit more common as time has progressed for people to have, I think, what is often called, serial monogamy, where it's like you have one, primary, one romantic relationship at a time, but there may not just be one over the course of your entire life. Um, but so that's kind of become more of the norm for maybe people in our generation. But now, you look at, the millennials, later generations, and it's becoming even more common to have, like polyamorous relationships. So it's not even just like one partnership serially, but like even multiple romantic relationships at a time. So I think, you know, looking at the trend, the way that I would put it is I think what we're seeing going forward, yeah, is that there's just going to be more variety in terms of the kinds of relationships that people have and the arrangements that they have socially with their most intimate relationships. And I guess even I think most of the principles that we've talked about so far have been pretty neutral in terms of how they apply to you know genders and different genders and sexual orientations and things like that. But that's another example of just like how relationships are changing. It's like gay marriage was not accepted a few decades ago, well, or even like a decade
A
or two
decade
ago,
ago.
right? And now that's gay marriage is legal in the United States and most advanced countries around the world, which a couple of decades ago was pretty much not the case anywhere. So yeah, again, there's just a lot more variety in what relationships can look like. And did you have? I think you maybe had more ideas about or a prediction about what you think things might look like by the year 2100.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you in seeing this trend toward greater variety. Although you had made a point to me earlier that I think is right, that I think we're even going to see it ultimately even maybe fit into a bell curve of a
Yeah.
new normal. But I think the bell curve is going to include much more variety. And
Yes.
so, even on a personal level, so I can say, so right now I am married in a wonderful monogamous relationship, but previous to that, I was involved in a more polyamorous situation. And one of the interesting things I noticed there was that one of the things that I think was even problematic about the way a lot of people now even approach polyamory is that they don't yet have this sense of the importance of commitment and investing in relationships. That often what drives people now to polyamory is maybe a sense of wanting to get away from commitment, where my comment was, if you're going to be polyamorous, you have to have double the commitment. So
Yeah.
even just, this is why even understanding these ideas about what makes for a good relationship and how it is all about growing over time and growing with your partner and investing in a relationship that will grow over time, that why these are just important principles to learn. But
Yeah.
I think you're right. And even going back to gay marriage, I think it's opened up the idea of even what marriage can be. So I think people know I live right near New York City, and I was walking through the city, and right now it's Pride Week or Pride Month, but everywhere
Oh
you
yeah.
go around New York City right around now, I mean, you see the rainbows everywhere,
Yep.
and this idea that love is love, that's one of their catchphrases. But I think even that captures something that is a development and is important. And where I even see some of the trends going, especially even with technology and genetics, where they're already learning how to splice genes, that pretty soon we'll be able to create babies that have
Uh,
genetic, you can have more than two genetic parents. And I
hmm.
absolutely think that even financially, the idea of a household where you would have, you know, three parents and two kids, and the parents would figure out maybe how they, you know, figure out their sexual relationships either with each other or with that's other people, or how that might change over time. I think we'll develop contracts that are even closer to business contracts, where you can form a business partnership in a variety of different fashions. I think people will go into forming household contracts in a variety of different forms. And but it's all about knowing the importance of communication and being focused on open communication and growth together as we figure out these contracts and grow together and negotiate. And I think it's going to be important as people are living longer lives. So one of the things that I think is maybe still a hard and fast timeline, although this might change too, is that it takes about 20 years, let's say, to raise a child. So if
Yeah.
you're going to raise a child with someone, maybe that is a 20-year contract that you're going to get into with one or maybe a couple other people, depending on what they come up with genetic
Hmm.
developments. Um, but I was going to say there that that might only be 20 years of a life that is 150 or more years long. So that might just be one, you know, time period of your life with relationships you would have, and then throughout the
Yeah.
rest of your life you would have other arrangements and other relationships. So I
Yeah.
think we're going to see even a lot more variation within an individual
It's life.
lifetime,
Yeah.
and then with just what is culturally accepted,
Yeah.
as formations of partnerships and relationships that people can have, and what is quote unquote considered normal.
Yeah. And yeah, I agree. Different arrangements, might make more sense at different phases of an individual's life. And yeah, and that the kind of cultural norms are shifting, like we've said, that people don't have to be beholden to fitting into like traditional norms anymore. And uh as long as like these, that makes it possible to innovate in the area of how you want to form structure your relationships and arrange these things in your life, which I think is by and large a good thing. It's not that every new arrangement is going to be like better than the old arrangements, but it makes it possible for more people to find out more new, better ways of doing things in different situations. and
Mm-hmm.
and you know and I agree that like there are probably going to be some growing pains as this unfolds, because when I was starting to date again, I dated a couple different people who were more kind of like polyamorous, involved in the polyamory community as well. And I noticed this kind of same thing as you, that this definitely isn't true of all of them. Some people are definitely much more self-aware about it, um, and doing it in probably a relatively healthier way. But
Mm-hmm.
it definitely, I got the sense as well that there are a lot of people who are exploring that more as a way of avoiding, having to have like a deep commitment to their current partner. And but I think maybe a lot of what might be motivating that resistance to committing to the current partner is that they're not getting all of their needs met in that current relationship. And to tie it back to what we were talking about before, about maybe they're getting the presence and the support that they need from their current partner, but they're not getting that inspiration and challenge that they need, or vice versa. Maybe they're getting inspiration and challenge, but they're not really feeling that kind of soothing and supportiveness that they want as well. And so this kind of goes back to like, well, maybe one model of doing this is that if you don't find a single partner that really hits all of those boxes for you, maybe you will be getting different needs met by different partners. And this, like you mentioned, I kind of think this is going to kind of fall into a sort of bell curve. And I think what will, this is sort of my prediction. Who knows? It's kind of hard to predict these things, but
Mm-hmm.
I would guess that just because there are like these two basic needs, kind of like at opposite ends of the spectrum that people are looking for, that what will end up being sort of an optimal situation for a lot of people a lot of the time, although not for everybody all the time, will be something more like a sort of duogamous relationship, not in the sense where that's usually used in terms of like bisexual relationships where you have, like one male and one female partner, but just that you have one partner that meets one of these basic needs for you more and one partner that doesn't, or that meets the other one. And because and I think you already see that starting to develop in the polyamory community where they even have some terms that kind of seem to suggest something along these lines where, you'll have a primary nesting partner, they'll call it, and then maybe other partners on the side. But I think a lot of times, because it's so much work to develop and maintain multiple simultaneous relationships, and the more different people you add to like a group relationship, like the more exponentially complicated it gets. um, I would think that it would tend to be like you'd have one partner that would be, your more supportive partner, that meets that need, and one partner that would be more like your inspiring partner that supports that need. And maybe the supportive partner would be, kind of a longer term partner, and then you'd have like more kind of serial relation, maybe not quite as long relationships for the inspiring partner. But
Well, I would give
that's
some pushback to that
okay.
actually.
I
But
mean,
I mean,
that's
and
yeah. I
we're
mean, that's
running a little
very
bit out of time.
general.
But
And I definitely, can I qualify it a little bit first, because maybe this is where you're going. But and like I said, that's not going to be ideal for everyone all the time. So like some people might have more people in a relationship, and some people might still be monogamous. um, but I think there is going to be that bell curve, and I would think that that is where that bell curve, kind of the center of that bell curve might fall around, just because of kind of the natural limits on either side and the basic needs that people are trying to meet in these relationships. But yeah, like if you have pushback on that, I want to hear it.
yeah, I'll give you a little pushback on that. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to make it really quick.
Okay.
But one of the points that I've always even wanted to make about polyamory is that, so when people talk about polyamory, they're usually talking about more what I would call poly sex relationships, whereas I always want to emphasize that it's about polyamory. It's about love. It's about primarily, even first, the emotional experience of loving someone. And this is something that I think we already really appreciate as a culture, that it is possible to love more than one person. I mean,
Right.
most people in the world now have two parents, and you love each of your parents differently, but you love them both.
Yeah,
Many
and
people
your
have more
love
than
for
one
one doesn't
children.
detract from the other one.
Exactly, right? You have more than one children, but you love them, and the love for one doesn't take away from the other. And I think as a culture, to the extent that we are still monogamous, we don't apply that learning that we have about how love works to our romantic relationships. And I don't think that as we're pursuing more and more romantic relationships, it's all just about needs and getting this need met here and this need met there. It's about wants and desires as well. It's about having a flourishing life where we're exploring all sorts of possibilities.
Sure.
And as we're living longer lives, I think there are just going to be many ways to do that. I guess maybe I'll just end this by
I'm
saying that we
trying.
probably should even have a whole other episode, because this gets into just more about innovation and integration, because it will be, I think, key skills and integration that people will need to learn to figure out, one, how to integrate a whole bunch of different relationships, and then how to integrate those relationships over time, which is going to
Right.
be a more pressing issue as people are living longer and longer and healthier lives. But maybe if it's okay,
Right.
we can just take that right into the recommended resources, because this
Sure.
perfectly ties
Yeah.
into the recommended resource that I wanted to bring up today. So my
Hmm.
recommended resource for this episode is the movie Her, which came out, I think, about a little over 5 years ago now. This is the movie with Joaquin Phoenix, and where Scarlett Johansson plays the AI Alexa-like bot, but who has a capacity to grow, which is significant to the movie. And just a couple things about the movie. One thing I love to point out is I always love movies that are very well crafted, and that is definitely what this movie is. So even just the example of the color palette of the movie. I remember hearing from Spike Jonze that when he was making this sci-fi movie, he was aware that lots of other movies in the genre rely a lot on the color blue. So they intentionally removed a lot of blue colors from the palette, and there's a lot of play with orange colors. So even just that level of detail to the craft of the movie and how it's presented, the visual storytelling of it. But then to get to the storytelling itself, the movie is called Her, but one of the questions is even who does her refer to? Because it's this story of Joaquin Phoenix as he's getting a divorce from his first wife and then falling in love with the Scarlett Johansson AI character. And not to give away the movie, but what happens is that she has this capacity for growth. And because she is this computer phenomenon, she's growing at this exponential rate and eventually essentially outgrows him and outgrows the relationship. And then because there's so sort of a serial monogamy, you see how the movie ends with him getting into a new relationship with Amy Adams,
another
who's like
human.
the girl next door. Yeah, with another human. But one of the things even that movie shows is even how, with the idea of polyamory as being about loving multiple people all at the same time, he is in love with all three women at the same time. And so it's already, I think, starting to get into what I hope is this conversation about how relationships can have these multiple different forms as technology develops and as we're living longer lives and as we're shedding some of the old preconceptions about love and relationships.
Yeah, I still haven't caught up with that movie. I remember, hearing about it at the time and thinking it sounded really interesting. But I mean, your description of it there, it makes me want to push it up to the top of my queue. So I'll have to check and see if I can.
I hope it's on Netflix. I don't know, or Hulu or Amazon, one of those.
Yeah, definitely going to add that to my list here. Yeah, and
so
it's
what's
just,
yours for the week?
Well, I mean, just to comment on yours there, I think it that does really kind of highlight how it's just going to be interesting to see how this all plays out into the 21st century, and how these kinds of issues develop. But and it's hard to predict, but it'll be interesting to see. So just to go into mine, that's a little bit more kind of based in the current situation instead of how things might go 50 years from now or whatever. So I was originally thinking of just, doing the obvious one. Maybe this is still a little obvious, but, kind of relationship book. But I've been thinking of recommending maybe one of John Gottman's books, like, the 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work or something. And a lot of people who listen to the show, probably, are readers and, have probably heard his studies and books referenced in a lot of other books, even if they haven't read any of his books themselves. And I do think his stuff is worth reading, but I while I was kind of looking through my notes before this episode, I remembered another book that I read about a year ago, I guess, called Hold Me Tight by Dr. Sue Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
And so she is the psychologist who kind of took the idea of the older idea, I think this goes back probably several decades now, the idea of kind of attachment relationships that was originally developed in, kind of developmental psychology for how children develop, healthy psychology based in, rooted in their attachment bonds with their parents, and their mother especially, and things like that. And Dr. Sue Johnson is the psychologist who kind of took that idea and applied it to adult relationships initially, I believe. And that kind of, I think, ties in a lot with, and a lot of what John Gottman says as well, I think ties in a lot with what you said about, the importance of being present and supportive as being, really foundational to a healthy relationship. And, I just, like, one quote of hers that I wrote down when I read the book that kind of captures this. I think she wrote, "Curiosity comes out of a sense of safety, rigidity out of being vigilant to threats. The more we can reach out to our partners, the more separate and independent we can be." And so then, like I said, she's kind of applying John Bowlby, I guess is the guy who originally developed the attachment theory. And she's applying that to adult relationships. And she talks about, like demanding and withdrawal as vicious spirals of insecurity. She talks about how relationships fail not due to increasing conflict, as you might expect, but more due to decreasing affection or emotional responsiveness, which again goes to John Gottman's research that actually it's the ratio of these positive to negative interactions that's really predictive of the long-term viability of a relationship. So she has this framework that she developed about emotional responsiveness being accessibility plus responsiveness plus engagement, which I think kind of ties into some of these things that we've been talking about today. So yeah, again, I definitely think this is worth, if you want to explore some of these issues further and kind of the psychological research on this kind of stuff. I think her book is a good place to start. So that's Hold Me Tight. And then she also talks in there about what she calls emotionally focused therapy that she's developed for helping couples who are struggling develop these attachment bonds. So if that's something that if your relationship doesn't feel quite as like safe as you want it to, like this is probably the best place to start to look into how to address those kinds of issues.
I love that.
And it's also I like a lot of the stuff we've talked about, we've been sort of focused on like really close personal relationships with sort of like a primary romantic partnership is kind of the paradigmatic example of that. But I think a lot of these principles are applicable a lot more broadly, in different ways to all of the relationships in your life potentially. So
no, I think that's great. And it even sets us up for talking about what episode is coming up next, because our next episode is the statesperson episode. And really what we're going to be looking at here is how relationships ought to be at a broader level. We're looking at society broadly. And there is this whole question of how you show up as both an individual in a wider social setting. So I think it already sets us up for what that exploration is going to be next week.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. So what's our weekly challenge for this episode for relationships?
Right. So in this episode, we actually want you to get out there and start building a good new relationship. And so what we're going to do is start a thread in the Facebook group where you can sign up for an accountability partner. So find the thread. There'll be explanations, but it's going to be pretty straightforward. Just how it works is the first person to come on the thread who wants an accountability partner will put #accountability1. If you're the next person, you'll pair up. So you'll also put #accountability1. And then the person after that will see, oh, these people have paired, and they'll do #accountability2 and then #accountability2. And ideally, we'll get it so that there are groups of 2 to 3 people formed. And there will be drawing again, and we'll have a group of lucky winners this time, because what will happen is that I will join one of the accountability pairings. And I think, Ash, you said you would join one of the accountability pairings as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes. And the whole idea with the accountability pairing is that this is a person that you can meet, and with either your partner or your group, you'll decide if you want to meet. We recommend either once a week or once every other week, perhaps once a month, but no longer than that. But it's just a person where you can start sharing your goals, the things that you're working on that you want to get done within that week or 2 weeks or a month. And here's a person who can hold you accountable to your goals, and then also give perspective on what it is that you're working on and what challenges may be coming up for you.
Right. Yeah. And I think in that thread too, we can have some discussion around, like you said, it doesn't even have to just be partners. We can have like small groups. If there are people who want accountability for, a specific type of project that they're working on potentially, or we can, maybe discuss like different tools or platforms that people can use to help them, maintain that accountability with their partners. So,
and if anybody out there has ideas, we definitely want to hear your suggestions.
We definitely want to have a conversation about that and see if we can kind of set up something here that will be valuable to, everybody listening, potentially anyone who's interested in joining with this, and, hopefully kind of start making this more of a community around these ideas, and, hear what you guys are working on, and all of us can start helping each other actually move towards those goals that we're working on. So yeah. All right. So thank you everyone for joining us again. And we will be back next week to talk about the role of the statesperson. And we will see you all then. Thanks again. Thank you, Joya.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. See you
Bye.
soon.
Talk to you soon. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Seeing Eye to Eye. You can find and subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, or via RSS. If you found value in this show, we'd love for you to give us a review on iTunes or tell a friend who might be interested.
Don't forget, you can also join the Seeing Eye to Eye podcast Facebook group to participate in the weekly challenge, ask questions, and add to our growing conversation. See you next time!